Morning. Tomorrow, we'll hear the Prime Minister's plan for a phased return to normal life. But for many people, there is one obvious prior question. If the vaccination campaign is going so well, if it's reaching all the most vulnerable people, why not start a wider opening up soon? What precisely do ministers and their advisers now fear once we start to unshutter the shops and book holidays and get back into the office? Today, Boris Johnson has to decide our road ahead. But if he's going to get public buy-in for that, he's going to have to be as frank about what he fears might go wrong as what he hopes will go right. We're going to hear from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, also criticised this week by the High Court for unlawfully failing to publish details of contracts signed during the pandemic. And the government advisor, John Edmonds, an epidemiologist, urging caution about the end of the lockdown. I'm joined as well by Mark Harper, who chairs a group of Tory MPs urging Boris Johnson to open up quickly. And from Labour, the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, will reflect on all of that debate. I've also been speaking to the Radio 2 presenter Jo Wiley about her sister Frances, who has learning disabilities and diabetes and is now in hospital with COVID.
There should be no debate. Forget the classifications, forget the cohorts, all those kind of things. Just protect these people. They are so precious. They are so vulnerable. They have no way of fighting for themselves. We have to fight for them.
Reviewing the news, including this morning's royal stories and Downing Street gossip, Camilla Tominey of the Daily Telegraph and Joe Coburn, host of the BBC's Politics Live. So much to talk about, but let's start with the headlines and Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Every adult in the UK will be offered the first dose of a coronavirus vaccine by the end of July under new plans to speed up the rollout. The government's previous target was to offer all adults the first dose by September, but Boris Johnson says he now wants the programme to go further and faster. The vaccine programme for priority groups is progressing faster than expected, with 2/3 of 65 to 69-year-olds in England having received a first dose a week after invitations were sent out. The Prime Minister will set out a detailed plan out of lockdown restrictions tomorrow. Israel is lifting some coronavirus restrictions from today after vaccinating nearly half of its population with a first dose. Shops, gyms, hotels and places of worship will be allowed to reopen, but entry will be restricted to Israelis who've been vaccinated or recovered from the virus with a so-called green pass as proof. The Duke of Edinburgh has spent a fifth night in a London hospital after being visited by his son, the Prince of Wales, yesterday. Prince Charles spent around half an hour with his father before returning to his Highgrove residence in Gloucestershire. 99-year-old Prince Philip was admitted on Tuesday on the advice of his doctor after feeling unwell. An engine on a passenger plane burst into flames above the US state of Colorado. It scattered debris onto the homes below. The United Airlines plane had 241 people on board, but it was able to return to Denver safely with no injuries reported. And children needing a heart transplant have, for the first time, benefited from a pioneering technique. The machine is used to revive the hearts of donors and can keep them beating outside of the body for up to 12 hours. The process has been used for adults for some time, and it's reducing the waiting times for life-saving operations. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks. Now, most of the papers are really excited this morning about the prospects for a kind of normal summer on the back of a much faster vaccine rollout than we'd expected. The Sunday Telegraph there, vaccine for all adults by July as hope is raised for the holidays. The Mail on Sunday, jabs for every UK adult by July the 31st. The Observer, I've got a scientist there saying that bans on outside sports can now end. Johnson is urged. The Sunday Express, all adults jabbed by end of July. All jabbed by July, almost identical there on the Sunday Mirror. And the Sunday Times has gone for the royal story because the royals are having a difficult weekend, to say the least, and they're focusing on the Harry and Meghan side of that family. Prince William, sad and shocked, it says, about his brother's behaviour. So we'll be talking about all of that, but let's start by talking about the vaccine story, which is really the story of the day. Joe, the Mail on Sunday has quite an interesting sort of approach to this. We are ready to reopen, they're saying, by the summer.
Right. I don't want to be a party pooper.
Don't be a party pooper, Joe.
And that picture,
don't poop on my party.
That picture looks very tempting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Crowds of people outside blinking into the sunlight, and I think it's going to be a sunny day today. This feeling of spring, talking about easing restrictions, which we are going to hear in some detail from the Prime Minister tomorrow. It's going to be gradual. It is going to be quite painstaking, because everything that you may have thought about Boris Johnson and the government up until now is turning on its axis, if you like, pivoting towards waiting to see if you ease one restriction, it needs to bed in, and you need to see what the impact is going to be on the data and on the number of infections before you reopen other parts of the economy.
So are you suggesting that ministers have learned their lessons from what happened about a year ago?
I wouldn't want to go necessarily that far, but yes, I think what they feel now is that the vaccination is here. We don't know all the data around whether or not it will cut transmission in huge numbers. There's no doubt that the information coming out of Israel is extremely promising. And although that there will be pressures from within the party, they are looking at schools, we know, on March the 8th, a full reopening of schools. We don't know precisely whether every secondary year will go back or whether that will be phased. And then they'll look at how that actually pans out. Then there may be a look at people meeting outside to have some sort of social contact, meeting on a park bench for socialising, not just exercise. Now, some people may think, well, I'm already doing that to some extent, but they are going to actually formalise that. Then there may be a look at more outdoor sports. Everything is going to be about being outside.
Stage by stage,
Stage
by stage.
March, maybe the end of March, non-essential retail, possibly hairdressers. Then into April, that might extend a little bit further, but it may, this picture here may not happen until May.
All right. Now, Camilla, nonetheless, the Prime Minister has to deal with a kind of great drum roll of enthusiasm from the papers. All the papers pretty much are roaring with enthusiasm about what's going to happen next.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that Downing Street has decided to fill this vacuum that has been occupying everyone in Fleet Street all week in the run-up to tomorrow's announcement with an actual news story, because I think a lot of papers in the week were speculating quite wildly about what might be in this roadmap. Hasn't even been finalised until, I think, last night, and it's going to be presented to Cabinet this morning. And therefore, this idea of focusing on vaccines, of course, quite clever, because that has been the shining light in the government's coronavirus response. And this idea that people of my age, my tender years of 42, might get a vaccine in July. I mean, I was expecting not to get a vaccine until autumn, maybe even Christmas. So clearly, if that plan has been accelerated, then the expectations will be high that if everyone's vaccinated by the end of summer, that people might be able to have a summer holiday in August, and equally that things will go back to normal. Although let's not even speak about talk that we know exists in the NHS about a so-called fourth surge in winter. Who knows what will happen in that eventuality? Let's
not talk about that, Camilla. Let us, however, talk about the royal family. I said it was a very difficult week for the royal family. The Duke of Edinburgh is, of course, still in hospital, aged 99, and there is this growing tension between Harry and William.
That's right. And I think that growing tension isn't going to get any easier when you consider that Meghan and Harry have now done and recorded their interview with Oprah Winfrey over in the US. We think they did that on Tuesday. And the royals are described by Roya Nicker in the Sunday Times as hiding behind the sofa, wondering what on earth is going to come out in this 90-minute chit-chat. Obviously, there's been a lot of commentary about the couple during the week. This idea of them trying to match up, them saying that they left the royal family because they faced too much scrutiny and intrusion, while at the same time keeping this whole argument about Brexit going because they're willing to speak to Oprah, the undisputed US chat show queen, about all of the intimate details that may ensue. And William is the focus, isn't he, this weekend, because there's been talk about whether this is going to help to repair the damage that has been done to the relationship in the past. There is this sense actually behind Palace Gates that they think that now that the couple are completely divorced from the family can now focus purely on the relationship rather than their business dealings with the Sussexes, which may be a point. But William described as sad and shocked. Sure. Also, a lot of talk behind Palace Gates about that statement that was released by Harry and Meghan following the Queen's announcement on Friday that they were severing ties, saying that it was insulting and disrespectful to start lecturing the Queen on the value of public service.
You don't answer back to the Queen, somebody said. You don't answer back to the Queen. Well, let's just hope the Duke of Edinburgh is not reading the morning papers in hospital at the moment. Joe, let's return to the coronavirus story, yes, because Mark Harper's coming on the programme shortly, and he has been one of the most vocal spokesmen for open early and open big.
Yes, well, as you said, he heads up this COVID recovery group of Conservative MPs. He's also a former chief whip. To some extent, actually, he was a bit of an unlikely rebel, if you want to call him that, when it comes to the issue of unlocking and restrictions. It's interesting, this piece, though, that he's done in The Sun on Sunday. It's not quite as hard-hitting as I might have expected, because that group, to some extent, is holding their powder at the moment. They're just holding back a little bit. And that is because they obviously want to see the full details of the roadmap. As Camilla was saying, it is going to be sort of unveiled tomorrow, signed off today. What is interesting, though, is this bit of it where he does talk about the idea, as Camilla said, if you're going to vaccinate all adults, but even over 50s, which is estimated to be done by April, why can't we open everything up all at once at that particular point? Because he refers to the statistic that the vast majority of people who die are in that much older age group and in the vulnerable age groups if they're covered and vaccinated.
It's a really, really interesting question. I think I now know the answer, which is that the rest of the adult population who haven't been vaccinated at that point, the virus circulates faster and faster among them, and that then produces more variants, more mutations, one of which might be successful against the vaccines.
And
I think that is the danger.
Well, and the counter to that from the government side, and certainly the government scientists, is they want that the infection rate and the numbers to be so low before they open up more widely that if there was an unforeseen event, a new variant, they would be able to target it extremely quickly. I think the pressure point for Mark Harper is going to be, once those vaccinations are done, the pressure from that group will become intense.
It certainly will. And Camilla, the Mirror has quite a useful kind of spread about people's hopes. Vax to normal, it says. A lot of the country is just relying absolutely on the vaccines that we currently have being effective, not just against the original coronavirus, but against the new variants as well.
I think the public will be expecting more opening up than last summer, naturally, when there were no vaccines. So this is the dilemma that the government faces. Not only are expectations high among politicians like Mark Harper, I note as well that all of the newspapers this weekend are carrying commentary from so-called lockdown skeptics, be it Steve Baker in the Telegraph or Graham Brady in the Sunday Express, etc. But equally, the public now are thinking, well, if we are now storming through these vulnerable groups, and that's what the government said, protect the vulnerable and indeed the NHS, then why can't we go back to normal?
Sure. Let me turn to another extraordinary story. Viewers may remember Hanford Parish Council and their extraordinary meeting. Well, number 10 seems to be rivalling them in terms of the sort of feud going on between a dazingly complicated number of different factions all going at each other. It's very, very hard to understand what's going on, except for the fact that poor old Dylan the dog is now involved as well.
I know, I love Glenn Owen, the political editor of the Mail on Sunday's take on all this, that Dylan has been used as a weapon of war between various camps in Downing Street. So you've got the Carrie Symonds camp, which now includes a new special advisor to number 10, Henry Newman. He used to work for Michael Gove, and I think viewers will be familiar with the psychodrama between Gove and Johnson. One of his other key aides, Baroness Finn, has been brought into the number 10 tent. That in turn has annoyed people who were once involved with Vote Leave. So Lord Frost, who's just been given a new job in the Cabinet Office, again rivaling Michael Gove. Is anyone still following this? Oliver Lewis, another vote.
It is. My question, Camilla, my question is, does any of this matter a jot?
Very good question. Well, of course it does, because we don't want infighting inside number 10, do we? Not least after the so-called divisive Dominic Cummings era getting in the way of affairs of state. There's a suggestion that Carrie Symonds is running Downing Street from upstairs. All of this points to a situation where the Prime Minister isn't running Downing Street, and that, of course, is particularly damaging for number 10 communications.
That's not great. He's got lots of things on his plate, Joe. One of them, of course, is the aftermath of the Brexit trade deal. Now, we've heard also today that the Labour leadership is allegedly, the Observer says, telling Labour MPs and Labour supporters not to talk about Europe, not to talk about Brexit, and it was barely mentioned, of course, in Keir Starmer's big speech this week.
Yeah, it is quite interesting, this piece by Toby Helm in The Observer, particularly the idea that they should stay stum, shouldn't say anything about Brexit whatsoever. Now, you may remember, of course, that in the election, Keir Starmer was very much blamed for the Brexit policy of the Labour Party that was seen to have done so badly, of course, during that 2019 election. And they also think, I think in Labour circles, what's in it for them? Where are the votes for talking about Brexit? This is a Conservative government's issue. They need to deal with it. And as we have seen, the teething problems that the government is talking about when it comes to border in Northern Ireland is going to run on far longer than they would like, which is partly why, of course, when we're talking about the infighting and the tribes at number 10, you have this issue of David Frost, the former chief Brexit negotiator, now going to take over that important role from Michael Gove. For Keir Starmer, this issue is something that he doesn't really want to get involved in because it won't win him back. He
may have to. We'll see. Joe and Camilla, thanks very much indeed. We should remember there are 3 big things on the number 10 agenda at the moment. There's coronavirus, bigger than anything else. There's the aftermath of Brexit. But there is also Scotland and the Union. And I think we can see the front page of Scotland on Sunday, because this is a very, very big week for the SNP. The great psychodrama, or the feud going on between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, culminates this week. And that paper is suggesting this could be the end game. That might be overexcited, but we'll see. Anyway, let's return to London and Mark Harper, who chairs the COVID recovery group of Conservative backbench MPs, who are calling on ministers to lift all domestic legal restrictions by the end of April. He joins me now. Mark Harper, welcome. What do you want to see from Boris Johnson tomorrow to make you a happy man?
Well, I suppose, Andrew, good morning from the Forest of Dean. I suppose really what we set out in our letter to the Prime Minister last week, which is once you've protected the top 4 most vulnerable groups, which we've now vaccinated and their vaccinations become effective by March the 8th, we want to start that unlocking process. And the most important thing is that we get all our children back to school so that their futures are no longer damaged. And then, as you've already discussed in the paper review, and I'd actually say it was a fairly cautious approach that we're taking, because after all, we're talking about getting rid of restrictions at the end of April, which isn't for another 2.5 months. Once you've vaccinated the top 9 groups, that means you've protected groups that account for 99% of the deaths so far and over 80% of hospitalisations. We think that's the point that restrictions should be lifted. And then between those 2 dates, you have a cautious relaxing between the two. It's step by step. We think that's sensible. And we're very driven by the science. It's about reducing deaths, reducing hospitalisations through the fantastic rollout of the vaccine. And of course, the targets that have been changed today reflect that pace of vaccine rollout. So those targets reflect the fantastic performance of the NHS.
Given the speed of the vaccine rollout, which is faster than we expected, does that mean that you'd like to see restrictions ended earlier than the end of April? In other words, mid-April or early April?
I think we'd be perfectly comfortable sticking to our original timetable. It was based on the vaccine rollout. You could be a little more cautious and say that now the government said that it's definitely going to get those top 9 groups done by the middle of April. Give that 2 or 3 weeks for the vaccination effectiveness to kick in. And then I think you're still being pretty cautious saying the end of April. So I'd be comfortable with sticking to that timetable rather than going any faster.
I've been talking to Professor John Edmonds, the SAGE advisor, who is concerned that opening all schools together next month could see the R rate rising above 1. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think the important thing is, Andrew, it was just over a week ago, actually, that the Health Secretary, we've got on your programme later, said in the House of Commons that actually infection rates weren't something that the government was now looking at, because, of course, vaccination breaks the link between people getting infected with COVID and people becoming seriously ill, hospitalised, and tragically some of them dying. So the important thing is that as you roll out the vaccine, you're driving down the serious disease, hospitalisation and death. And that way, I think you can safely open schools because we've protected the most vulnerable people who are vulnerable to COVID. And once you've done the top 9 groups, and it's not just everyone over 50, remember, it's everyone over 16 with a health condition that makes them vulnerable to COVID, you're delivering that protection, the saving lives protecting the NHS, not from us all staying at home, but from the vaccination.
Sure. There may be a slightly perilous period ahead when there are large numbers of younger adults who haven't been vaccinated and amongst whom the virus is still circulating and potentially mutating. Patrick Vallance, who's the chief scientist, says the lower you get the numbers of infections, the lower the chance you get mutations. That's right, isn't it?
Well, it's two things. First of all, Patrick Vallance has said we're never going to get rid of COVID. It's going to be endemic. And Neil Ferguson, who many people call Professor Lockdown, has said if you try and get down to near zero COVID, either zero COVID or trying to eliminate it entirely, you're effectively going to be in a lockdown forever. And I don't think that's acceptable. On the point about variants, which is an important point, it's worth remembering all of the vaccines protect against serious disease and hospitalisation and death against all of the variants. And the point I would make is that given that you've got a significant amount of virus circulating around the world, we're not going to be able to stop variants getting here. The way you protect against variants is our fantastic genomic sequencing program and the fact that all of our vaccine developers will respond to changes in the virus by altering the vaccine. That's the way you protect against variants. If we're going to say we're so worried about a future variant that might not be susceptible to the vaccine, that's a recipe for never unlocking our economy and our society. And I don't think that's really an acceptable proposition.
It sounds to me rather as if those people who expect some Conservative MPs to rebel against the government for not going far enough are out of date, that broadly speaking, you are now on the same page as Boris Johnson.
Well, look, I don't know what he's going to set out tomorrow, and we've seen lots of things in the newspapers, but, I mean, the Cabinet hasn't seen these proposals yet, so I'd rather wait to see what he announces tomorrow. We've set out our view, which is we think once you've vaccinated the top 9 groups, the people that account for the bulk of the deaths and hospitalisations from COVID, the most vulnerable, which will now be, the government says, by the middle of April, so allow a couple of weeks for those vaccinations to become effective. We think by the end of April, the case for domestic legal restrictions limiting what people can do fall away. And we think at that point, people should be able to get on with their lives. Government may still give them health advice, and there may be things people do voluntarily, but the legal restrictions should fall away at the end of April.
So the current legislation ends on the 31st of March. If you don't get what you want, are you prepared to vote against the government and vote those down?
Well, look, I'd rather take a more optimistic view, which is I'm hoping what the Prime Minister announces tomorrow will be something that I and my colleagues can support. So let's just wait and see, Andrew, shall we, and see what the Prime Minister brings forward. I hope we can support it. And I wrote to him, and 63 of my colleagues wrote to him in that spirit of unity. And let's see if we get that when he announces his proposals in the House of Commons tomorrow.
Mark Harper, standing in front of a rather lovely dappled Forest of Dean painting. Thank you so much indeed. Well, the weather, pretty good, I think. News at last. Yes, there's been a lot of rain, but it's been so much warmer. Out walking the dog yesterday morning, it felt like full spring. Sunshine on the grass, daffodils erupting. More of that, please. Over to Thomas Schaffenacker in the weather studio. Thomas.
No problem. You got it, Andrew. Absolutely. We've got some spring weather on the way. Actually, next week we could see temperatures up to 18 degrees in some parts of southeastern Britain. So not everybody's going to get the higher temperatures. But in the short term, there's still some rain around, and we've had rather a lot of it, especially across southern parts of Wales in the last 24 hours. Flood warnings in force from the Environment Agency. Up to 100 millimetres of rain or more fell in one or two locations. And you can see still some rain around in this southwestern portion of the UK. But it's mild, even 12 degrees in Belfast above the average. But we've got around the mid-teens in the southeast and East Anglia today. Now, this weather front really is stubborn. It was there yesterday, it's here today. It'll be here through tonight and into tomorrow. And you can see that rain in the southwest of England, Wales, and spreading into Yorkshire as well. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, different story tonight. In fact, it's going to be clear, even a touch of grass frost in one or two spots. So starts off nice, fresh and sunny in Belfast, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Some lovely sunshine there also in the afternoon. Still some cloud around across the central swathe of the UK, but the mildest conditions with a bit of sunshine, I think, for East Anglia and the southeast. And as we go through the week, it will turn milder and milder, I think, in the south. Andrew, back to you.
Mild in the east, soggy in the west, cold in the north. Thomas Schaffenacker, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, Professor John Edmonds is a member of SAGE and also sits on NervTag, which advises the government on new respiratory viruses. I spoke to him just before we came on air, and I began by asking him for his assessment of the current situation.
So cases have been coming down quite rapidly. Cases, hospitalisations and deaths are coming down. So it's all very good news. I think as the epidemic shrinks, then we push it into harder to reach groups, harder to reach populations. And I think that that's probably starting to happen as we speak. And so we're starting to see the epidemic slow down. So the rate of decline slow down a little bit as we really as it becomes concentrated in slightly harder to reach groups. Very similar to what happened in late spring and summer of last year as the epidemic shrunk. Then it persisted a little bit in certain groups in the population.
There's talk today in the papers of every adult in Britain being vaccinated by some point in the summer. Now, the question is, if that's the case, why the caution about unlocking? I suppose my question is, what could go wrong?
It's fantastic news if we do manage to get adults vaccinated by end of July, as I've seen reported today. That would make a huge difference, of course. But the vaccine doesn't give 100% protection. And as we roll it out to adults, I mean, if you look at currently, for instance, we have quite a high fraction of hospitalizations in the under 70s who are just starting to vaccinate now. So if we eased off very rapidly now, about almost half of our hospitalizations are in the under 70s. So if we eased off very rapidly now, we would get another surge in hospitalizations. So we have to ease very gradually. Otherwise, we will put the health service under pressure again, and we'll get a surge in hospitalizations and indeed deaths.
How concerned are you about the South African variant at the moment?
Yes, that is definitely a concern. It's here. Exactly how widespread it is very, very difficult to say, but we do have it. It's being held in place now as everything else is being held in place by the lockdown. The risk comes really when we release the lockdown.
Is the danger that if the most vulnerable groups have all been vaccinated, but the virus is still circulating amongst younger people, that then allows new variants to appear, new mutations, which challenge the older group too?
That's certainly a risk, yes. So the more infections there are in the community, then the greater the risk of further mutations occurring. And so it's certainly a risk if we allow high rates of infection in certain parts of the communities, younger individuals, then we do run the risk of further mutations occurring, which could reduce the effectiveness of the vaccination program.
What does the data tell us, or the modelling tell us, about the effect on the R rate of returning all the schools in one go?
Well, one thing we do know, even without models, is that in November, when we were under lockdown, the reproduction number was below 1. The cases were coming down, with schools open, of course. But at the same time, the new variant was increasing. And so the reproduction number for the new variant was actually above 1. Now, if we repeated that again with exactly the same situation, we would expect the reproduction number to be above 1 with a lockdown with the schools open. We're not exactly in the same position, though, because we've vaccinated a number of people, a lot of people since then. And, of course, the new variant itself has immunized others in the population because we've had high rates of infection. So I think if we open schools now, I think we are, the reproduction number is likely to go to be something close to 1, potentially slightly above, but it could be at around 1 or maybe just slightly below, but I suspect it would be around 1.
Does that mean that you'd be more comfortable opening primary schools and then, after a gap, secondary schools?
Obviously, I'm just sticking to the epidemiology rather than other needs. Of course, there's great needs to get our kids back in schools as fast as we can. But it's sticking to the epidemiology. Yeah, of course, it's always safer to take smaller steps and evaluate.
If the government now allows, as we read, 2 households to socialise together outside, do you think that would have any effect on the R rate at all?
Not much. Mixing outside is pretty safe.
Given the falling numbers of infections and hospitalisations, is there any real risk of yet another lockdown at the end of this if we get it wrong?
there's always a risk because if we ease up too quickly, then we will put pressure on the health service quite rapidly again, because we're not immune yet. The vast majority of us are not immune. The vast majority of us are still yet to be vaccinated or indeed yet to be infected. And, hopefully we go through the route of vaccinating individuals. And, so easing up too quickly will put pressure, cases will increase again. We're not through this yet, unfortunately.
We're not through this yet. You were pretty pessimistic earlier this year, at the beginning of this year. Are you now in a relatively optimistic frame of mind?
I think the success of the vaccination programme is amazing, and that is and always was our way out of this. I think that we are in a really strong position because we have managed to secure such large numbers of doses and delivered them rapidly to our population. But it takes some time. It's going to take months yet to vaccinate all of us. We're all at risk, and we can all spread the virus. And so until we've all been vaccinated, I include children here, then there is going to be significant risk of a resurgence.
And that suggests that as soon as all the adults in the UK have been vaccinated, you would like the government to turn to children?
I think there's an argument for turning to children as fast as we can. I mean, I've 2 children myself. They're in secondary schools. And I think that, there has been major disruption in schools, and there will continue to be major disruption in schools until we have vaccinated our children.
So, in short, is this a moment when we can be confident about relaxing the rules?
I think, yes, we can be confident. We will relax the rules. They are coming, but we can't rush it.
Professor Edmonds, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. The Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, joins me now. Mr. Lammy, there's a general air of optimism at the moment. The unions, however, have said that it would be reckless to open all schools by the middle of March. Do you agree with them?
Now, look, we all want children back in schools on March the 8th. The question is not that, which I think the whole country wants, it's how we do it safely. And to do that, you do need Nightingale classes. It's bizarre that last week during half term...
Sorry, by Nightingale classes, you mean classes outside schools?
Extra classes outside schools. It's bizarre that the government didn't use last week to vaccinate teachers, which would have helped considerably. Why have they not done that? And you've got to have mass testing that works across our school estate. So it's how we do that so the kids can come back.
You want the testing, you want the earlier classes, but in principle you support all children being back in schools on March the 8th.
If it could be done safely.
Because the unions are still saying that is absolutely reckless. Well, totally opposed to it.
It's understandable that frontline teachers and head teachers don't think that the government have got a grip of this situation, because I'm afraid Gavin Williamson has let them down consistently over the last year.
So what's the policy response in that case? If I'm a parent sitting at home and I want to know whether my Labour representatives want my children to go back to school or not?
We want children back in schools on March the 8th if it can be done safely. That's the position.
Let me turn to Sir Keir Starmer's big speech. It was billed as a kind of 1945 Beveridge moment. And yet when you look at it, there's only 2 real hard policy proposals. One is a British recovery bond and the other is a business start-up pledge. That's not really an Attlee scale speech, is it?
Look, it was a great speech that set the frame and the tone for where we are at this moment. And that is to say that he wants to root out inequality, and he does believe in using the state to support business and families. And so Keir and the Labour Party care passionately about the fact that we've got a government that says it's fine that kids don't need support on free school meals, that we should cut universal credit, that we've got a north-south divide that's bigger than at any time since the First World War. We say that's unacceptable. You need the ambition of that moment after 1945, where we created the welfare state, where we created the NHS, and we supported families and business going forward. Where is that ambition?
But you also need very specific policies. Now, the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, has a very ambitious programme that he's talking about this morning for a general writing off of all debt. He says this is an absolutely debt-laden, debt-sodden economy, and the government should simply cancel all debt. Now, that is the kind of very big idea. That seems to people maybe a 1945 scale idea.
It's 2021. The election is in 2024. We've got lots of time for big policy ideas. We're approaching the budget. We will hold this government to account. And actually, a British bond, recovery bond, is a big idea, because let's invest in the state. Let's have people's money work for the country. And of course, those start-up loans for businesses is a big idea. Businesses need support. By the way, the leisure, hospitality industry also need a VAT cut if they're to go forward.
Business bond, then, the recovery bond, because either it's at normal rates of interest, because the government can borrow at the moment anyway, or it's at a more advantageous rate of interest. If it's at a more advantageous rate of interest, and if it's not, there's no point in having it, then that basically means that people who invest in it are going to be better off, and they're going to be better off people. So in other words, this is a subsidy to the better off.
Well, we had the pension bonds that raised 10 billion. It can be at a normal rate of interest. What people have, if they invest in bond, is security for their money. And if you've got £250 billion worth of British taxpayers' money sitting in banks, then let's put it to good use. Invest in your country's economy. Yes, you can get a good rate of return. You should be able to take your money out, of course. But the longer you leave it in, you get a better rate of return. That's generally how a bond works.
Can I turn to one of the other big issues this week? You'll have seen that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was found to have acted unlawfully in terms of when he released details of contracts that had been signed off by his department at an early stage in the pandemic. It was a very, very stressful period for the government and the Health Secretary and the Health Department. I do understand all of that. What do you think should happen now? What should be the next move on this?
Well, he should publish the contracts, because the court has found it unlawful. He should cancel the scheme, the temporary scheme that he's been using without any accountability or any transparency. He should come to Parliament on Monday and explain what he's going to do. It is outrageous, frankly. If this is the sort of behaviour, giving contracts to your pub landlord and your best mate, that you would expect in a banana republic, yes, well, not indeed in our own country.
Though the National Audit Office has said there was no evidence of conflict of interest. Going back to Labour, one last question about the Labour Party. The whole point of this speech, and I take it Labour's, as it were, reorientation, is to show that Labour can be the party of business. Now, you have a problem at the moment, don't you, which is that the biggest problem faced by a lot of businesses at the moment is the post-Brexit trade negotiations, the trade deal. Lots of people complaining about the red tape and the regulations and tariffs and so forth. Lots of fishermen, lots of agricultural businesses also complaining about that. And yet at the same time, we read that the Labour Party is putting Brexit off its agenda. You're not talking about Brexit anymore. You're not talking about Europe anymore. And indeed, it was barely mentioned in Sir Keir Starmer's speech.
Nonsense.
It was barely mentioned in Sir Keir Starmer's. That's factually correct.
Andrew, my colleague Lou Haig has been talking about the situation in Northern Ireland. Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Cabinet Office, has been raising these issues consistently. I've been raising issues for lawyers now as a result of leaving the European Union. We've been supporting musicians and the problems that they're having.
So you're as pumped up about this issue as ever?
Of course we're raising those issues because they're central to the British economy. And that's why we need business relief for small businesses too, and we've called for that.
So why was it not more mentioned in the speech? You would think that would be a sort of centrepiece of a big Labour speech at the moment.
It was a visionary speech looking forward with hope and ambition, building on the state and building on the ambition of that Attlee government. Brexit, I'm afraid, has happened. I think it was the wrong decision, but it's happened.
But surely our relationship with the EU going forward is one of the big future issues to be discussed. That is one of the things that the Labour Party is going to have to talk about really fairly relentlessly between now and the next election. It just seems at the moment that certainly your leader isn't very keen to do so.
Well, look, we're four years out of the next general election. Of course our relationship with the European Union is essential, but we are in the midst of a pandemic. And what we want to do is reopen the country safely and securely. That's got to be our priority. Hold the government to account on things like contracts, but also set a vision that's optimistic and ambitious, not just for families, but also for businesses.
And no one has said to you, David, don't bang on about Brexit.
Absolutely. Absolutely not.
All right, David Lammy, thanks very much indeed. Now, the broadcaster Jo Whiley's younger sister, Frances, has a genetic disease called Cri-du-Chat syndrome. She's got severe learning disabilities and she has diabetes. Earlier this week, Frances was admitted to hospital with COVID. For her family, the worst nightmare realised. I spoke to Jo just before we came on air and I began by asking her how her sister is this morning.
I actually don't know this morning, so I'm slightly anxious. I've been trying to call my mum and I haven't heard anything. So waking up to having no news is a scary thing. It's been the worst week of our lives, without a shadow of a doubt. 24 hours ago, we were talking palliative care. And yesterday she rallied round and we are seeing her oxygen levels rise. So at the moment, we've got hope. 24 hours ago, we didn't have any hope at all. So, she is an amazing fighter. She always has been a great fighter. And I'm just hoping that her spirit gets her through.
And how are you and your parents?
It's been awful. It's been absolutely awful. My parents, I don't think, have slept for days. We are really fortunate because they allowed my mum and my dad to be with her, because the idea of Frances having to do this on her own is unthinkable. And also, actually, people couldn't cope with Frances. When she was admitted to hospital, she was so terrified that she rampaged through the hospital and people couldn't contain her. And security guards had to be involved. They had to restrain her. And the fact that my mum was there and was able to talk her down and then to be there with her and to try and give her oxygen was crucial, absolutely crucial. So my mum and dad are amazing people. They're very strong. They're very, very focused on getting her better. But they're pretty done in and very anxious.
On the same day that Frances was tested for positive for COVID, you were offered a vaccine. You called that a terrible twist. Why do you think that happened?
I have no idea why I was offered the vaccine and my sister wasn't. It felt like the cruelest twist in the world, because I've been asking for her, wanting for her to have her vaccine for a year, to be honest with you, to be protected. And then for me to suddenly get a call to say that I've got the vaccine, it just felt hideously unfair. Andrew, she actually was called in for her vaccine last night. My mum got a message to say that she could get vaccinated, but it's too late. She's fighting for her life in hospital. I mean, it couldn't be crueler. It just couldn't be crueler.
Now, one thing we know, partly thanks to charities like MenCap, is that people with learning disabilities are at much higher risk of catching COVID and then, sadly, of dying from COVID. For people who don't understand that, can you explain why that's the case?
If you have a learning disability, you have very complex needs. So I can best explain it by talking through my sister. So Frances, it's quite difficult to predict how she will react to things, like physically and emotionally. And that's the same with anyone with a learning disability. So going into hospital, the easiest thing, and what happens with everybody when you've got COVID, you're given oxygen. They couldn't do that with Frances because she just couldn't tolerate. She was petrified. She just would not allow anyone to put anything near her face. She has an incredible superhuman strength, so you can't physically make her lay down. You can't do anything. And that is why her oxygen levels plummeted. That's why she ended up fighting for her life, because you couldn't do the most basic, simple thing that you would do to try and get somebody through COVID. And, we were at our wits' end. I was there at 4 o'clock in the morning just saying, how can we get oxygen into her? And the medical professionals who are doing an amazing job just aren't equipped, because it's all so new. They don't know how people with a learning disability is going to react in this situation, which is why it makes such sense to just get them vaccinated as quickly as you possibly can. Take away that problem, take away the burden on the NHS. Just stop these people coming into hospital who are absolutely petrified. Quite often they can't communicate, they're terrified, they don't know what's going on, they have no comprehension of what COVID is and what's happening to them, and they're there bewildered in a hospital. Just don't put them through that. Stop everybody having to go through that whole experience. Just keep them safe and protect these people, because they are so precious, they are so vulnerable, and we should have looked after them a long time ago. I feel I'm talking to you today because I just want to give them a voice, because we should be doing more. We should have been doing more for these people who have no way of helping themselves. They're just wholly reliant on us.
Jo, you've had what you say is one of the worst weeks of your life, but you want to use that experience to send a message on behalf of people with learning disabilities. What is your message this morning?
The message is there should be no debate. Forget the classifications, forget the cohorts, all those kind of things. Just protect these people. They are so precious. They are so vulnerable. They have no way of fighting for themselves. We have to fight for them. Get them and their carers who are going into the home, and this is how it's spreading. Get them vaccinated. Stop them dying now.
Jo Whiley, thanks very much indeed. Now, I'm looking forward with great enthusiasm to talking to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, but he's not available quite yet, so I'm joined by Jo Coburn. who's come back again very kindly. Joe, we're going to be talking with Matt Hancock about this Good Law Project case in the High Court,
yes,
which he has lost and has indeed acted unlawfully. It's a very, very complicated case, so maybe we can explain to viewers exactly what it's about.
Right. Well, I mean, some of the contracts, if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, contracts that were signed particularly for things like PPE, that personal protective equipment.
The visors and the rest.
Absolutely. And as you remember, of course, there was a shortage. And to some extent, the government would say, look, we were at the start of a pandemic and the pressure was on. And we were, to some extent, scrabbling around looking for contracts. But they did need to follow due process. And what they have been found and publish them and actually follow due diligence in terms of those contracts. I believe you must have the Health Secretary.
He's just arrived. He won't have been able to hear that, but the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, joins me now. Matt Hancock, we were just discussing the High Court case that you have lost. You have broken the law. Can I ask you about that? The High Court has ruled that you acted unlawfully by not publishing contracts quickly enough that your department struck during the coronavirus pandemic. And these are contracts that were worth millions and millions of pounds, sometimes hundreds of millions of pounds. Would you like to take this opportunity to apologise to people for that?
Well, thanks, Andrew. And I could hear the discussion that you've just had. And as was set out, it's really clear what this court case is and isn't about. The court case did not find that there was a problem with any of the contracts. What it found is that whilst, of course, contracts like this need to be published, and we've published all of the details that are required, you're supposed to do that within 30 days. And on average, in the height of the pandemic, we did that within 47 days. So we were just over a fortnight late on average with this publication. And the reason for that is because my team were working 7 days a week, often 18 hours a day, to get hold of the equipment that was saving lives.
I understand that, but as you know, I'm sorry, Andrew, Matt Hancock, as you know, some of those contracts were nonetheless highly controversial, and the judge himself, Lord Justice Chamberlain, says that you spent, and I quote, vast quantities of public money on pandemic-related procurements. The public were entitled to see who this money was going to, what it was being spent on, and how the relevant contracts were awarded. And he's absolutely right, isn't he?
He's 100% right. And that is absolutely possible. The technical issue is that we were just over a fortnight late on average with the publication of these things. And the reason for that is a reason that I back my team up 100% on.
OK,
so that they were totally focused on saving lives. If you think, just remember back, Andrew,
I know the situation was stressful.
And the situation was that we were very, very tight on PPE. And thankfully, thanks to the incredible work of my team, we didn't have a national shortage of PPE. And that's because they spent all of their time buying life-saving equipment, even though the paperwork was a little bit late.
Listen, we both know that some of these contracts were controversial at the time and subsequently. My question is, if you think that the judge was right, if you think this is really just a technical issue, why did you spend £200,000 of public money fighting the case in the first place? Wasting that money.
I don't think that there's been any of that. We do have to.
Well, the money's been wasted.
Well, if you ask why people have raised a case like this on this matter, perfectly reasonable question to ask. But of course, the government has to defend its position, because what we did was we did what was right, which was to buy life-saving equipment as fast as we possibly could. And then, of course, to make required publications.
I do remember back. But the question, I'm sorry. The question is, was it the right PPE? Were these the right companies? Did they provide value for money? And was their equipment good enough? And there've been questions about all of that. The National Audit Office, whose report preceded all of this, have said that there was a special, as it were, fast-track lane for people who had contacts with politics and government, and that such organisations were 10 times likelier to get the contract. And that has led many people to think there is something wrong here, something fundamentally wrong going on in the way these contracts were awarded.
No, as you say, and as you said in your response to your earlier interviewer, who was making all sorts of false allegations, the National Audit Office found that all of these contracts were awarded in an appropriate way. Of course, we fast-tracked the leads that we thought were most likely to be able to get hold of the stuff fastest, and they did that, as you've just read out, the 10 times faster.
Let me read you out something else from the National Audit Office report, because this is quoting directly from them. And they said that your actions, and I quote, diminished public transparency and the lack of adequate documentation means we cannot give assurance that the government has adequately mitigated the increased risks arising from emergency procurement or applied appropriate commercial practices in all cases. That's the National Audit Office basically saying you did not give them the information that allowed them to take the judgments you've been talking about.
Andrew, as the National Audit Office said in the quote you just read out, this was an emergency situation. My team worked so hard and they were successful in ensuring that there was never a national shortage of PPE. I back them every step of the way, and any Secretary of State would, and the whole nation should be, and I think actually in very large part is incredibly grateful for the work they've done, because we've saved lives. Now, of course, there's the loose ends that need tying up. But what is most important in the middle of a pandemic is you do everything you can to save lives. Like, for instance, the subject that we're talking about today, which is the absolutely superb vaccine rollout and the ability now to be able to set more advanced targets. Again, because my team have worked so hard and done so well, no matter what the naysayers say.
So you have nothing to apologise for at all, despite losing a case and being legally in breach of the law?
Look, people can make up their own view about whether I should have told my team to stop buying PPE and spend the time bringing forward those transparency returns by just over a fortnight, or whether I was right to buy the PPE and get it to the front line. You tell me that that's wrong. You can't. And the reason you can't is because it was the right thing to do. And all the legal cases about timings of transparency returns are completely second order compared to saving lives. And there is no health secretary in history who would have taken the view that they needed to take people off the project of buying PPE in order to ensure that 9 months later, the health secretary didn't have a slightly bumpy interview on the Marr programme. It's not what it's about, Andrew. It's about doing the right thing.
Bumpy interviews on the Marr programme are always what it's about. Now, I spoke to Jo Wiley a few moments ago, and she's been in a very, very distressing situation with her sister, who has learning disabilities and diabetes and is now in hospital suffering from COVID. Jo was offered a vaccination before her sister, and many people, including MenCap, believe that people with learning disabilities in particular have been rather under-catered for during this pandemic emergency, and we're not doing enough for such people. What do you say?
Well, I feel very, very strongly about this, and my heart goes out to Jo and to her sister and her whole family. And it's such a difficult situation, and it should remind us all that even though the numbers who are suffering from COVID is going down, thankfully.
Do you not find it odd that she was offered the vaccine before her sister?
Yeah, so I was coming on to that. So it is very important that we follow clinical advice in terms of the order of prioritisation, which we have done throughout. And in Group 6, as it's called, that's where we vaccinate both those with learning disabilities and also their carers. And that's who that group is being vaccinated now. I'm sorry to jump in one more time, but that is the case for people with severe learning disabilities. People with mild to moderate learning disabilities are right at the bottom of the list at the moment. And yet, according to MenCap, they are 6.3 times likelier to suffer from COVID than the population generally, and likelier to die as well. In other words, I'm putting to you, there is a particular problem with people with learning disabilities that perhaps we have been overlooking as a country. Well, that group are now being offered vaccines as we speak, and not the lower group. Not mild to moderate. I felt so strongly about this that when the JCVI, the independent group of clinicians, when they came forward and with their prioritisation, their draft prioritisation, I asked them to go and check again on this precise point, and they did, and they came forward with the prioritisation according to according to how you save most deaths most quickly. And I think that is a reasonable way of doing it. So we've followed the clinical advice, but my heart goes out to the Wiley family. It just is such an awful situation.
Have you seen data yet that shows the vaccines actually stop transmission?
Well, I'm absolutely delighted that the vaccine rollout is going so well. We have seen early data that there's a reduction in transmission from those who get the jab, but that is early data, and there's more work that's being done. But we are able, from today, to be able to announce that we will be offering a vaccine to all those who are over 50 and in the top 9 priority groups by the 15th of April, and then to all adults by the end of July. And it's because of the success of the vaccine rollout that we're able to do that, and that will have an impact on how quickly we'll all be able to return to normal, which is obviously what everybody wants to see.
So what is the impact of that, albeit early data, on hospitalisations and deaths?
Well, again, there are signs that the numbers in hospital are falling much more sharply than they were in the first wave. And there's further analysis to be done on that. But clearly, the level is still far too high. That's why the Prime Minister will be setting out a roadmap. We can't lift the measures right now, but we can see that direction of travel. But it's not just because of the vaccine, it's because everybody's been coming forward and getting the vaccine, and that incredibly high take-up rate that we're seeing, especially amongst the over 70s. Are
you comfortable with the fact that all the vaccines we have at the moment are effective against all the new variants, including the South African variant?
Not yet, no. So the good news is that as of this morning, 1 in 3 of all adults in the whole country have been vaccinated. That's where we've got up to this morning. It's great news. We are confident that the vaccine works effectively against both the old strain that's been here for some time and the so-called Kent variant, which is now the main source of infection in this country. We do not yet have the confidence that the vaccine is as effective against the South Africa variant and the variant first seen in Brazil. But we do think that the measures that we've taken, both the enhanced contact tracing, really clamping down when you see one of these, and the measures at the border are reducing those new variants here.
So how many cases of the problematic South African variant have we got in this country at the moment?
Well, in total, we've seen around 300, but most of those are now historic cases from over a month ago. The latest data show that there's around a dozen new ones, so a much, much smaller number. And each time we find a new one, we absolutely clamp down on it, enhance contact tracing, testing all those around the person who's tested positive, and taking whatever action is necessary.
So that sounds as if the South African spread is shrinking, is it?
I think that's a good summary, yes. And we've also seen fewer coming through the borders, obviously, since we took the much firmer measures at the borders, meaning that you have to have either home or hotel quarantine, and hotel quarantine if you've been in South Africa in the last 10 days.
Most of the country is thinking about the summer holidays. Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, says people should not book domestic holidays. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, says it's much too early. But you say, I've booked a holiday, I don't know if you've paid for it, in Cornwall yet. Who should people listen to?
Well, there's no actual distinction between the different positions.
There is between book a holiday and don't book a holiday.
I booked mine ages ago, and I book it because I booked the same place as last year as soon as we finished that holiday because we enjoyed it so much. So that's the.
Have you paid for
it? I paid a. What does it matter? I paid a deposit.
Just interested.
The point is. But what I also wanted to say to you, Andrew, is that the Prime Minister will be setting out more details on all these things in the roadmap published tomorrow. So then, hopefully, that will give our best assessment of the future as we can see it. But of course, we'll also remain vigilant and look at the data as we go through this.
Just very quickly, your advisor John Edmonds says that the R rate could rise above 1 if all schools are reopened on the 8th of March. Are you at all concerned about that?
Well, this is another reason why we must stay vigilant. there are just under 20,000 people in hospital right now. Thankfully, with COVID, thankfully that number is falling sharply, which is good. But we want to see it go further, and we're going to be vigilant as the effect of all measures on the number of infections, and also the link from infections to hospitalisations and deaths, which we hope will be changed by the vaccine.
We're out of time. Matt Hancock, thanks very much for talking to us today. Thanks to all my guests. Thanks to you for watching. I'll be back again next Sunday at the usual time, but until then, goodbye.